We are recording this podcast on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. We wish to pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend our respects to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who may be listening.
Hello, and welcome to Novel Feelings, where two psychologists take a deep dive into your favorite books. I'm Priscilla.
And I'm Elise, and welcome to episode 2 of season 3. Back to a review episode. We haven't had one for a little while, not since episode 1. I'm glad my mum died. But today we are reviewing Tiger Daughter by Rebecca Lim, and I'm so excited to talk about this book.
Me too. If last episode was your recommendation, this was the book that I've been pushing to everyone to read. So I am very excited for this conversation.
And if you are interested, we do also have an interview with the author, Rebecca Lim, who kindly joined us for an interview not so long ago. So we have tagged that onto the end of this episode. I'll post the timestamp in the show notes if you do want to skip to that. So stay tuned.
And in case you missed our last episode, go back and listen to it, please. But here's what we're doing differently this season. We are doing a read-along book club where we plan to release episodes every 2 months, and we'll post discussion questions to Instagram and Twitter so that we can encourage some conversation in between episodes.
Yeah, so of course, remember to follow us on social media to keep up to date with those at novel_feelings, wherever you find us. And we are also running a reading challenge, which is up on the story graph and Instagram too, if you do want to just use the Instagram tiles that we've created. So it is a mental health book club themed challenge. We're including all of the 6 review books that we're covering in 2023 alongside some additional prompts. So if you want to diversify your reading this year in terms of mental health, that is a fantastic challenge to check out.
Well, before we dive into our review, hey Elise, how would you rate your week on a 5-point scale?
Pretty good week, actually. I'd give it a rating of about 4 out of 5 champagne toasts. So my partner and I, we had our anniversary celebration last weekend, 8 years together, which is pretty cool. And went to a winery and had a really lovely lunch. And it looks like we've decided on a wedding venue as well. So that's some news. I'm engaged. That's happened.
Congratulations.
Thank you. That's something that's happened since the last time we recorded.
Very exciting.
How about you, Priscilla? How would you rate your week on a 5-point scale?
I would give it a 3 out of 5 cameras. I am deep in vendor research for my wedding as well.
What? You're getting married too?
Surprise! That's right. We both got engaged.
Not to each other.
Yeah, not to each other, although I love you very much. But yeah.
Same to you. Yeah. So we got engaged to our separate partners within 2 weeks of each other back in December last year. Yes. So it has been a little while since we've recorded. But yes, that was a very exciting time.
Indeed. Next time you hear from us, hopefully it'll be 5 out of 5 wedding dresses.
We will see if we can post a little selfie or something to Instagram when we do go wedding dress shopping, because we are going together. So that will be fun to see each other try on some beautiful gowns.
Absolutely. But to go back to what we're actually here for.
Back on track.
Yes.
Yeah, so just a reminder to please rate and review us. So if you leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, we will give you a shout out next episode. And a big thank you to everyone who's left us 5-star reviews so far. We do have a few new ratings, but we do only have 1 new written review. So we'll just highlight that here.
Yeah, so Dr. Shulin Moore is a GP, bibliotherapist, and an author, and she gave us a 5-star review. Thank
you.
So just an excerpt from her review. I have shared the episode about one of my favorite books about grief, A Monster Calls, on my Facebook page, Byron Bibliotherapy. I feel so many people would benefit from the honesty of that book, especially if they read it before an episode of loss. Please check out Dr. Shulin Moore at Byron Biblio.
Thank you so much. And before we get started on our review, just a couple of disclaimers. So we are a spoiler podcast, but one thing we are doing this year is that we are breaking our episodes into 2 parts. So we'll flag when we do go into the spoilery bits later in the episode. Non-spoiler content and overall reviews will come up first. Also, this podcast should never be taken as therapeutic advice. And we're speaking today as psychologists and book lovers, not necessarily as people with lived experience of some of the themes that are covered in this book. Our voices are limited this way, but if you do have lived experience, please do let us know what you think of this book.
If you haven't heard of Rebecca Lim before, let us tell you a little bit about her. So Rebecca Lim is an Australian writer, illustrator, editor, and lawyer. She's amazing. She does so many different things. She is the award-winning author of over 20 books, including The Astrologer's Daughter and the best-selling Mercy series. Rebecca is a co-founder of the Voices from the Intersection initiative to support emerging young adult and children's authors and illustrators who are First Nations, people of color, LGBTIQA+, or living with disability. She is a co-editor of Meet Me at the Intersection, a groundbreaking anthology of YA own voice memoir, poetry, and fiction.
And a little bit more about Tiger Daughter, her book that we are covering today. So Wen Zhao is determined to create a future for herself that is more satisfying than the life her parents expect her to lead. Wen is the daughter and only child of Chinese immigrants whose move to the lucky country has proven to be not so lucky. Wen and her friend Henry Zhao, whose mum and dad are also struggling immigrants, both dream of escape from their unhappy circumstances and form a plan to sit an entrance exam to a selective high school far from home. But when tragedy strikes, it will take all of Wen's resilience and resourcefulness to get herself and Henry through the storm that follows. So why did we choose this book?
Well, like I said at the start of this episode, this is the book that I've pushed on to everyone to read. I can't remember exactly how I found it, but I imagine it was the title that first caught my eye. Like Tiger Mom is such a loaded term, I would say. And I thought Tiger Daughter as a title was a curious twist on that. But anyway, I borrowed it from the library and read it in one sitting that night. I loved it so much and just couldn't put it down. Aside from the quality of the story, I think it's also important for us to highlight a middle grade book about immigrants.
Yeah, well, I'm really glad you recommended this. Such an interesting discussion coming up. Some of the topics that we're covering today include grief and the ripple effect of suicide. Just to note that we won't go into details around the book's depiction of suicide itself, like the methods, but we will be talking about it more broadly. We're also talking about the Asian diaspora in Australia, community attitudes and stigma around mental health, in particular around depression and suicide, and touching on topics like domestic violence, racism, and misogyny. We will start part 1 now with our non-spoiler discussion and review first.
I guess to open our conversation, Rebecca Lim has talked about how she wrote this book partly or mostly due to disappointment that the reading list for high schools has not diversified over the last few years. So my question to you, Elise, is what sort of books did you read in high school?
Good question. It was a while ago now, so my memory's a little fuzzy. In the upper years of high school, I remember covering Jane Eyre, Romeo and Juliet, The Crucible, Antigone, like the Sophocles plays. We covered a few, I suppose, quote-unquote classics, classics in the Western tradition, I suppose. And we did have a range of, I suppose, middle grade books over the years, but mostly books written by Australian authors as well. But in retrospect, it was very white and it was very middle class. Yeah, not a lot of diversity. How about yourself?
Well, I went to high school in Indonesia, so we did not read Western classics. I'm trying to think. When I was in high school, English was very much about grammar and actual ability to speak English, and the Indonesian classes were also the same in terms of its focus on grammar, but we did read some poetry and short stories from Indonesian literary writers. Yeah, we didn't have library time the way kids here do these days. So yeah, it was all the nerds, I think, who went to the libraries for fun. So I guess it's understandable why Rebecca felt compelled to write this sort of book, because given the Australian population, where, what was it, almost 50% of the population was born overseas? Is that what came out in the last census?
I don't know, but I wouldn't be surprised. It's pretty high, the percentage of Australians who are born overseas or have a parent born overseas.
Yeah, well, given that, it's interesting / disappointing if publishing hasn't kept up.
Absolutely. The title of this is, of course, Tiger Daughter. So what comes to mind for you when you hear the term Tiger Daughter?
I guess to me, a tiger mum is a phrase that signifies an incredibly strict parent who demands high levels of academic success from their children. I guess in my head, it immediately conjures up an Asian mom, an East Asian mom, I guess, especially, who like sends her kids to private schools that are highly academically achieving, puts her children into piano lessons right after school and Chinese school or language school on the weekends. So when I first heard of Tiger Daughter, the first thing I assumed was that it's about an Asian girl. What about you? What did the term Tiger Daughter conjure up for you?
Pretty much the same, having heard of the tiger mum archetype before. So I don't know. I was curious, like, was this tiger daughter going to be the equivalent of a tiger mum, or was she going to be contradicting a tiger mum or challenging? And in fact, it's not really quite either of those. It's, I guess it's more about her own tenacity and how forthright she is in doing what she believes is important as the story goes on.
Yeah, her own fierceness, I guess, in that way.
Yes, that's a great way to describe it. Anyway, we should talk a little bit more about the book itself. So this book covers the story of Wen and Henry, two close friends who are, how old are they? 13 or 14 as the story goes along.
That. Yeah.
Yeah, younger teenagers. So this is a middle grade book that we are covering today. And as we mentioned in the synopsis at the start, we're meeting these characters at a challenging time in their lives where they're looking at going into an entrance exam to potentially get into a more selective high school. Both are from, I guess, a disadvantaged socioeconomic background. Neither family is exactly wealthy. So this would be a very big deal for both of them if they were to get in, and also a bit isolated from some of their other peers at school as well. So their friendship is quite close too.
Worth noting that Henry particularly is a bit more isolated because he's newly arrived to Australia, or more recently so than when, and his English isn't the best, I suppose, when we first meet him in the story.
Yeah, he's not a very confident English speaker.
And his family, even though both families are disadvantaged, Henry's family is particularly poor, and there's a bit of stigma attached to his family because of his mom's mental health difficulties.
Yes. And we won't go into too much detail at the moment until we get into the spoilers section. But this, an important theme in this book is the tragedy, which is a suicide of an important figure within the community that happens reasonably early on in the story, and the ripple effect that occurs in response to that death. It covers, it's such a tragic thing that happens, and I know I was pretty teary when I was reading about some of this. I also had the experience of reading the book quite quickly when I picked it up, not in one sitting, but within 24 hours, which is rare for me. Just like this really hit me in the feels, to put it lightly.
Yeah, it's interesting because when you read the blurb and then you start reading it, well, at least for me, I kind of guessed where it was going. But when the tragedy actually struck, it was still it still created such an emotional response.
I knew that this was a book that was going to be about suicide in some capacity, but I didn't know who it was who was going to die. So I wasn't necessarily surprised by it, but I didn't know who. Yeah, I didn't know who it would be. So I was kind of gripped in that sense of trying to figure out like what's actually going to happen, and it's going to affect these young people so much, and I want to give them a hug, and I can't.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. I think what I found most interesting about the portrayal of the ripple effect is the stigma, which I think is particularly relevant to I don't want to say Asian cultures, because obviously we're not a monolith, but particularly to Wen and Henry's community, where there's still not a whole lot of understanding or compassion around mental health difficulty. Suicide brings a lot of shame to the family, and instead of support, the community might pull away from them.
Yeah, and the sense that the figure who dies is seen as being a bad parent, seen as being weak as well. And I suppose the community responded initially, at least, getting a sense that they weren't going to rally around poor Henry and his father. They wanted to avoid the topic.
Tangent, but I'm reading Alfie Scott's book, The One Thing We Don't Talk About, and it just popped into my head that there's a lot of silence around what happened initially. Yes. And that reinforces the stigma, like Alfie talks about in her book.
Yes, absolutely. Though, again, we won't go into too much detail just yet, but one of the great things in this story is the sense of community that does eventually come together, and what that might look like when you are more, I guess, accepting and empathetic and reaching out around someone's experience of grief rather than avoiding, and what a positive impact that can have. And that, I guess, is where the tiger daughter thing comes in, and how Wen's really motivated by a sense of injustice that's happening around this community response to suicide. So, yeah, using her fierceness and her strong belief of right and wrong to make a positive difference. And I really loved that. That was such a lovely character arc that we see her going through.
Yeah, great. Another big theme of this book is gender roles, essentially, and how domestic abuse and unhealthy family dynamics can transpire on the basis of really rigid gender roles. I'm totally in awe about how this book, which obviously happens in middle grade and young adult, but there's just so much, this book tackles such big topics that are difficult for adults to read and discuss, and it does it so beautifully.
And sensitively as well. You see a lot of empathy for multiple characters, even those who might be holding up institutions or structures or values that Wen, and by extension the reader, don't agree with necessarily.
Yeah, absolutely. And it does a wonderful job explaining how that person comes about their beliefs, or why they're doing these things, but not excusing that person's actions.
Yes, definitely. Yeah. And, we see depictions in this story of verbal abuse, emotional abuse, and financial abuse. I can't recall if there's an instance of physical abuse as well, but I feel like there was a physical threat.
Yeah.
Even if there wasn't an actual,
Yeah, there are things like thrown, I'm pretty sure. I think coercive control is the word that comes to mind when I think about the things that happen in this book and the fear that it creates. And you don't need physical abuse for something to be violent.
Yes, and that's holding up and being reinforced by the traditional gender roles that we see in some of these households depicted in the story as well. So the mother's role, the expectations that are placed upon her, and the father's role too. So
yeah.
And then intersecting with that as well, we have another key theme, which is around the immigrant experience too.
Yeah. So there's the model minority myth that I think affects Asians in particular. if you've never heard of the term model minority before, I'm going to try and explain it in the best way that I can. Essentially, it's that you're part of a minority and you're seen as the good minority. You know, Asians are seen as submissive and quiet, and we keep our heads down and we get the work done and we don't cause trouble. And that's why we're okay and accepted, which is actually not a good thing at all. That can be really harmful. Like, for one, the impact of that on other minority groups is quite negative. And it also is bad for the people who are seen as the model minority because, we can be treated badly because we're seen as we'll just accept whatever we're given. And there's a lot of, let's not rock the boat, or, let's not, be angry. Let's not point out injustice or unfairness. And I think we see quite a bit of that in this book about how some characters are expected to just keep their heads down and keep going regardless of what treatment they're receiving from the wider society.
Yes, definitely. And we see, of course, a range of difficulties that both families have experienced as well when it comes to the immigrant experience. So Wen's father, who I believe was a qualified medical doctor who couldn't, his qualifications were not acknowledged or not transferable.
He was supposed to be a surgeon, but then he kept failing the medical tests in Australia, and he could be a qualified medical professional in some other capacity, but not a surgeon. There's the isolation as well that immigrants experience due to language barriers, financial struggles, which is, can be tied into that lack of acknowledgement of their qualifications. And of course, racism.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, those are some of the big themes of this book, but there are a few others that are notable as well, I think.
Yeah, definitely. So the idea of friendship and loyalty. Wen and Henry have such a beautiful friendship in this story, which I really loved. Platonic male-female relationship as well, which I do like. And then, finding community, building your own community as well around your own values, I think is a very important theme in this story.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, what's your star rating, Elise? What's your overall feeling of this book?
I gave this a 4.5 out of 5. Like I said, I read this really quickly, which is rare for me these days, which indicates just how much I found it to be really gripping and emotional. My only issue with it, which is a really small issue, is I would have loved a little bit more expansion, I guess, around the ending. We can touch on that more later. But I do recognise it's a middle grade book, so we can't necessarily have War and Peace length complex ending to everything. But I just thought it was a really beautiful story. It handled its themes really well. And I do hope this ends up on some more reading curriculums.
Agreed.
How about yourself?
This is a 5 out of 5 stars read for me. Like I said, I told multiple people to read it. And I read it in one sitting, just literally did not move from the couch. Wow. I think to borrow the message that you sent me after you read this was that it's a really good book, but really sad as well. Yes. It is very confronting in parts, not in a bad way. It's just because of the themes that it covers. Some things are just really sad to read and quite scary, I think.
You can't have a light-hearted book around these themes.
Absolutely.
It's pretty difficult to do so. So understandable.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So maybe not a beach read.
No. No, but it's also not a book that you need to mentally prepare for. But yes, I agree with you on the ending, I think. But minor issues. It's a minor issue,
Amazing. Well, very positive review from us. Let's dive into the spoilers now and talk about some of those things we were alluding to but not mentioning explicitly before. The first thing we want to talk about in a bit more detail is the book's depiction of suicide and Henry's mother. of course, as the person who does take her own life in this story.
Oh, it's so tragic. It's so sad. Henry's mother's experience of depression is really fascinating, I guess. I don't know if that's the right word to use, but it's a good depiction of how mental health issues and cultural beliefs around mental health intersect, because she's so isolated. She doesn't speak English, she doesn't have friends, and by the nature of depression, she's not motivated to reach out and be part of this community.
Just the lack of a support network beyond her very immediate family. I can see why, that lack of connection would be contributing to and a result of her depression.
Well, I guess immigrants give up a lot to migrate. They leave behind their families and everything they know to come to a place where, they should be able to improve their lot in life, I guess. But that's really not the case for a lot of people. And we can see, for Henry's mom, poverty likely contributes, well, not just likely, I'm sure poverty is a huge part of poor mental health. Like, how can you not be depressed if you don't know where your next meal is coming from?
Yeah, and we obviously need to be really thinking about all the environmental factors that contribute towards depression as well, because I don't know, in psychology we obviously tend to focus a lot on individual thought processes and the responsibility of the individual to look after their own mental health and to think their way out of depression and suicidality and so on. At a surface level, that's what seems to be the messaging a lot of the time, and you can't think your way out of poverty.
No, and this feels particularly relevant right now with, the threat of recession and the sixth rates rise in the last few months. I worry we're going to see a lot more mental health issues coming out of this.
Unfortunately, yes, it's most likely to happen.
The community response is a big part of the story. And we see the contrast between Wen's desire to support Henry and her parents' desire to stay away. And it's kind of harsh, but realistic, I think, especially Wen's mom's initial response to suicide. The way she was saying that Henry's mom's a failure, essentially. That, she was a bad mom and now she's worse because she's left her family. And it's there's a part of me that's how could you say that? There's another part of me that's yeah, I can see that happening in, my community as well.
But of course that's contrasted to Wen's desire to support Henry and the active steps that she takes to reach out to him and his family as well. She doesn't have the support of her mother in this, and she doesn't have the knowledge, let alone the support of her father in this as well. But I just really liked the journey that we see with how forthright she is about, even seemingly little things like taking him food, taking him his homework, writing notes to him on his homework when he can't even show his face to her. His experience of grief is so intense, understandably, that all of this is happening with a door between them, either a closed door or a fly-wire door.
Yeah.
And her persistence, I thought, was really great. So even though she's not getting, I suppose, the instant gratification of helping a friend, and she's not getting support from her mother, who is, eventually does allow more of this to happen, does sort of see things from Wen's perspective, but how she persisted with what she felt was right. I really liked that. And seeing Wen's mother's character arc as well, and how she started to come around to this too, as well as her own, I guess, transformation that she experiences as the story goes on.
It was so lovely to see how Wen's persistence rubbed off on her mum, and that her mum started wanting to help as well and starting to come out of the fear that has ruled her life essentially since she became married to Wen's father.
And, we see as the story progresses that she starts to not necessarily disobey, but I guess start to untangle some of the strict expectations that are placed upon her, like starting to push back, whether it's, cooking fewer meals than expected of her. Her meals still sounded so much more elaborate than what I would have on an average night, but my goodness, using her chosen English name, which, that's not to say people have to use an English name, but it seemed like it was her preference and something that she hadn't been able to use herself.
Wearing comfortable clothes as well and not having to dress to the nines. And it's so lovely that she finally became more of a part of the community herself, because she was also very isolated because her life was all about obeying her husband, really.
Yes. Yeah, and taking on the role at the pharmacy as well and having that connection with not just her boss or her colleagues, but also the people who come in, who she has a unique ability to communicate with many members of the community who come into the pharmacy, and such a valuable asset to have there, and something like that can give her more of a sense of I was going to say purpose. I feel like her work, I don't want to dismiss the importance of being a full-time parent and looking after a family and the satisfaction that you can get from that, but she seemed to be missing something, and that was perhaps giving her more of a sense of purpose than what she had originally.
And autonomy, I would say, because it's hard.
Thing.
Yeah, it's hard to find. I imagine it would be hard to find purpose in something where your role is defined so strictly, and you're not allowed to assert any control or choice in that role, which is what happened to Wen's mum as a full-time wife and mum.
And of course, her father, Wen's father, is the figure we were talking about earlier, who is in that strict head of the household role, who is sadly the instigator of a lot of abuse and just a really dangerous dynamic that's going on in that household, which is really horrible to read. And I've just got such a sense of Wen's fear and the mother's fear as well.
Yeah, there's that whole chapter called The Fear, and then another chapter called The Rage that I think encapsulated those feelings really vividly. Yeah, I think, I mentioned before about how this book shows how patriarchy fails everyone. And I was saying that in reference to Wen's father, because he has these beliefs that a man has to be a certain way. And since he migrated to Australia, he wasn't able to do that. Like, he wasn't able to be this well-respected, wealthy surgeon. So he refuses to do anything medically related and has chosen to do what he feels is a degrading job as a waiter in a Chinese restaurant. And he feels it's almost like he can't be what he believes he should be. And he shows some sign of depression as well. Like, one talks about how he can't get out of bed, but he's so angry because he can't fulfill what he thinks he should be.
Yeah, that kind of externalizing symptoms of depression, that he's, taking that all out on his family. And, I do wonder if it's a sense of, he doesn't have much control over his own career, or he's lost a lot of control over his own career. So he controls his family.
Absolutely. And again, it's this interesting intersection between that and the very specific cultural beliefs or teachings, I guess, that he holds on to.
And look, he does let up a little bit as the story goes on. He doesn't, wouldn't say he has a full redemption arc, which I think would have been unrealistic if he had completely changed. He does, I suppose, start to release some control. He starts to have a bit more respect for Wen's mother's autonomy and her choices, reluctantly at first.
Yeah. He extended a hand towards Henry's dad as well and offered to help him with some work.
Which is a big thing.
Yeah. And yeah, like you said, we can't really expect a full redemption arc. And even that, like we sort of hinted about earlier in our star rating, we felt this arc is almost a little too neat at the end. But yeah, I accept, again, like we talked about before, this is not fully perhaps the genre to explore the complexity.
Yeah, and we do have a lot of complexity in the story already. Yeah. It's not impossible that he had that much of a change of heart. I guess just, my knowledge of how ingrained some of these beliefs and behaviours might be does make me question if it would happen to that degree, see that much change in that time frame in real life. But I'm not upset about it.
Yes.
I want there to be a note of hope at the end of the story.
Yeah, and it's entirely possible that he's, as you say, let go of some control in this aspect, but we don't see beyond that ending.
Because it does come to like a climax as well, where things get really bad, and then that I suppose was his rock bottom, and a turning point for him to start to see things shift around. So sometimes people do have a dramatic change in attitude after getting to that point, and that extreme. So yeah, I don't know. My criticism of it is fairly minor.
Yes, agreed.
Yes. Shall we quickly talk about our favourite moments before we wrap up?
Yes, absolutely. So I guess for me, the chapter that introduces us to Wen's father's rage and the fear that she and her mom experience because of that rage, those were my favorite moments. And I also really loved the moment when mom decided to ride in the ambulance with an elderly lady who needed her help. I think it's fair to say that went against direct order from Wen's dad.
It did.
Which she would never have done before.
That was a good demonstration of how far she'd come as a character.
What about you, Elise? What are some of your favorite moments?
Yeah, well, there was a line that I really liked. Yeah, my psych nerd side coming through a bit, I guess. But perhaps I think it might have been in one of those chapters you mentioned. The line, like Pavlov's poor dog, I step back at the side of him when Wen's father appears through the screen door in a particularly frightening moment. I thought that was a good depiction of just how ingrained and automatic her fear response was to her father. On a lighter note, I did really like the homework drop-offs to Henry that happened. So the notes that they shared, and when purposefully messing up the long division to try to, almost get a rise out of him to get that response. So I just thought that was very sweet.
Yeah, it's a lovely book overall.
It really is. Yeah. All right, now we have finished our pretty glowing review. We have a few discussion questions for listeners, and we'll briefly mention some of the things going up on our website before we get into our interview.
Yes, so first of all, what did you think of Wen as a character? Was there anything about her personality that you really liked or disliked?
What are your thoughts on Wen's father's character arc? And how different do you think he would be if he had not migrated to Australia?
Here's a quote from Rebecca Lim. Tiger Daughter asks readers who have never been told go back to where you come from and never will, to think about what it would be like to be marginalized for more reasons than being female. How has the book impacted your thoughts or knowledge on this topic?
Have you ever been part of a community rallying together to support someone going through a tough time? And if so, what was your experience?
And lastly, what types of books should be on primary or secondary school reading lists?
All right, so if you have some answers to those questions, please do let us know, because we would love to hear your thoughts. And just briefly, we have some resources that will be going up on our website too, if you're interested.
Some of the resources we will link to include a link to Standby and Lifeline for information about assisting people who are bereaved or impacted by suicide, And some information about what coercive control looks like as well from Relationships Australia, Victoria.
And now it's time to mention what our next book is that we'll be covering for a review. So this is our book for May, and we will be covering Queenie by Candice Carty-Williams. This was my suggestion as a book that I read last year, and look, I won't tell you too much about it now, but let's just say I really liked it. It was unexpected, some parts of it. I think we're going to have a really interesting discussion with this book. I will just briefly read the synopsis. So, Queenie Jenkins is a 25-year-old Jamaican British woman living in London, straddling two cultures and slotting neatly into neither. She works at a national newspaper where she's constantly forced to compare herself to her white middle-class peers. After a messy breakup from her longtime white boyfriend, Queenie seeks comfort in all the wrong places, including several hazardous men who do a good job of occupying brain space and a bad job of affirming self-worth. As Queenie careens from one questionable decision to another, she finds herself wondering, what are you doing? Why are you doing it? Who do you want to be? All of the questions today's women must face in a world trying to answer them for her. This book is kind of advertised as being something like Bridget Jones or a kind of lighthearted rom-com. Just a note, it's not. It actually does get pretty deep into some pretty intense stuff. We will talk about it more and provide content notes as we go up, but just don't go into it expecting Bridget Jones. I will say
No, I have heard that warning before as well. That's why I think that book's been on my shelf for 2 years, and I'm always like, not yet.
I think you'll like it.
Yeah.
But again, it's just not a rom-com.
Cool. Well, I look forward to reading it. And I hope you guys will join us for that episode.
So that wraps us up for today. We do have our interview with Rebecca Lim coming up very soon.
Hey guys, my name's Abby and I co-host the Book Life podcast with my best friend Mo. We cover fantasy, sci-fi, and historical fiction books and talk book-related topics like our favorite character types, world building, and books versus their movies. New episodes drop every Monday on your favorite platform. Now, back to your show.
Rebecca, thank you so much for joining us today. We're really looking forward to hearing more about Tiger Daughter, your writing process, and your approach to this work. Such a pleasure to have you here today. How are you going?
Good, and it's such an honour to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely, our pleasure. And congratulations on the critical acclaim that you've received for Tiger Daughter.
Thank you.
We are curious, how would you describe your readers' reaction to Tiger Daughter?
It's really interesting, actually, because I've had some readers just say, I've never seen, my kind of story portrayed like this before. And, there's been a lot of tears, I guess, and people sort of recognising elements of their lives in it. But then I've also had, it's quite interesting, a lot of Asian readers have said, oh, I think this is stereotyping because my parents are the most indulgent parents in the world and none of this would ever happen to me. So it's been a real spectrum of responses, I think.
That's interesting. Sometimes I think we have so little representation that when one book comes out with that representation, it's expected to do quite a lot.
I know, it's expected to cover everybody and it just can't. So I remember I went to a school recently and the teacher warned me that one of the students there wanted to fight me. She was quite angry about the portrayal because she said, you're making all Asian dads seem crazy. And I actually said to the students when I got there, she didn't actually want to ask me the question herself, so she ended up having a teacher ask it. But I just said, this is just one story. Elements of it are my story. And so some of the things in that book actually did happen to me. So, you're very lucky that maybe you've had a really kind of generous upbringing, but, it's just one story and there's many, many stories, and go write one if you think this one isn't representative.
Expanding on that, do you feel pressure to have the perfect representation or to represent all experiences in your work?
I just don't think anyone can. And so I actually think works are more powerful when they come from, your particular lived experience, and you don't necessarily try to make them universal and try to fit, everyone into the same mold as you. Things like gaslighting or coercive control, financial abuse, people have seen elements of that in their own lives. So you don't have to be from the exact same cultural background as the protagonist to actually sort of understand where elements of the story are coming from. So I never try to write universal things because I think that's sort of setting yourself up for failure and also just making something very bland. because, not sort of speaking about your own experiences just makes the whole thing a bit, I mean, like who are you pitching it to? What are you trying to say? It sort of doesn't have real authenticity. So I don't try to make things general. I try to make them quite specific.
So speaking of, I guess, the parents in the story, we understand that Tiger Daughter, obviously the title of the novel, is a reference to the term Tiger Mother. We're curious, what does that title mean to you?
It was quite deliberate, that choice. I mean, a lot of people have probably noticed that it's kind of that play on words, because I think, at the time I was reading it, I might have sort of like remembered Amy Chua's Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother. And I had a tiger parent type upbringing where, we did do the 3 musical instruments and all that kind of thing. And we had sort of extra Chinese school when we were little kids. So taking all those elements together and sort of seeing the pressure at my daughter's school, because my daughter's school is actually predominantly Asian and South Asian, just seeing all the stuff that happens with kids that go through these really, I wouldn't say they're abusive, but they're really controlled upbringings, and how they kind of, they come out of it either really broken or they come out really strong. And so I wanted to take that notion of, the negative notion of the tiger parent and make it something positive and actually reflect the journey of the children who come through that kind of upbringing.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I can relate to that element of, I wouldn't call my parents tiger parents, but when I was in high school, I did have to go to like extra tutoring until 10 o'clock at night.
Wow, that's quite extreme, because I got when I went to Chinese school for a few years, it was like the Saturday morning thing that took a few hours, but it wasn't, maths and science. It was like, more Chinese language and culture. But I know lots of kids, like my daughter had a birthday party once when she was about 9 or 10 years old, and there were 16 kids there, and just before the cake came out, 9 of them vanished because they had to go to, a tutoring school, and that was it. Like, she had 6 girls left to sing the birthday song. So, like seeing all that kind of stuff happening, and, mothers who are like I'm an Australian-born Chinese mother, so I can't handle the tutoring pressure that's going on, so I'm going to take my daughter out of this school and put her somewhere more relaxed. There's all that stuff happening in my daughter's life. So I just kind of wanted to reflect that, one, the Asian experience isn't monolithic. There's various spectrums of how kids are raised, but, I just really wanted to critique that whole, the Confucian thing where the kids have to sort of like obey the parents, and they're like the property of the parents, and they have to do what they're told, and there's not a lot of room for agency. I just really wanted to look at that a little bit harder.
Sort of expanding on what we've talked about before, we were struck by how Wen used her rage and sense of injustice to challenge the beliefs of the adults around her. What do you think about the role of anger in driving positive change?
I don't know how you guys feel about this, but anger is a massive motivating force for change. I think the angry woman is a massive, force for change in society, because things don't get done unless an angry woman is behind it generally. So, I mean, for me, the genesis story for this book, which you've probably heard about now, is that I went to my daughter's parent-teacher interview, and she was given a tailored book list that was supposedly tailored for her, and she looks just like me. The top 3 books on that list were from, the 1930s, the 1970s, and the 1985, and they were the same books that I was reading at that same school at the same age. So 30 years had gone by, and the same books were on the book list. And so for me, I was so furious about it, because I thought, have a look at your students. It's really important still to read the canon and to understand Picnic at Hanging Rock and, all the places that we came from, and colonialism, all that kind of thing. But, for it not to have changed in 30 years at the same school that I went to was a really big kick up the bum for me. So I kind of went home, I steamed home furiously and said to my daughter, I'm going to write a book for you guys, and even if it doesn't get published, at least I've done it. And so that was kind of the response. It was like a really visceral response to her book list.
I think that really demonstrates how we can use anger for social good.
Yeah, absolutely. Like in a sort of clean and furious and kind of, change-making way, rather than just railing about it and doing nothing. I just kind of thought, if there's not enough representation on her book list, the people who notice that have to do something about it.
And I think that sort of anger is very different from the anger that Wen's dad experiences in your book as well, that he is so angry about the hand that he's been dealt or the things that he's had to go through, but he doesn't do anything.
And it's paralyzing. Yeah, it's quite paralyzing. And so, I mean, I tried to make him, he does seem like the baddie, and so that's why a lot of Chinese kids in particular go, well, my father's not like that, so that's just her stereotyping people again. But for me, I tried to make it quite nuanced, because, for most immigrant and refugee families, the father is locked into position, right? He doesn't have a lot of options. If his degree isn't recognised here, or he fails at his work, or he can't bring money home, they literally don't eat. And so, like, what I was trying to say was, you understand why he's angry, and you understand why he's sort of all choked up, and he can't kind of like deal with things in a sort of like really reasonable way, and he brings it out on his family, because where else is the unkindness going to go? He's got no other control. But I also wanted to show that, that kind of, as you say, toxic masculinity doesn't just occur in, well brought up Australian families with money. It happens everywhere.
Yeah, he was a fascinating character, although obviously very difficult to read about at times. And I think it just really demonstrates the good side of anger and the negative or harmful side of anger as well. So it was an interesting experience, I guess, the parallels between those two characters and their very intense emotional experiences.
He's got a tiny kingdom, and he basically, just rules that with an iron fist. So it's that kind of thing, like she takes her anger and she thinks, I'm going to use it to help people, and even if I get in trouble for it or it impacts me, it doesn't matter because people are in need. So I tried to show sort of all of the elements of a household that's really sort of suffocated by anger, but you can use it in different ways.
Mm. And speaking of that friendship, of course, that's really central in the story. We were really struck by the touching and loyal friendship between Wen and Henry in this book. Can you talk a little bit about what inspired their friendship?
Sure. I used to write sort of mostly young adult novels, and so there are often many tropes in young adult novels where there's always going to be sort of the good boy and the bad boy and the love interest who's a female who doesn't realise that she's startlingly beautiful but is in fact, masquerading as an ordinary person. So like I often play with those tropes when I write for YA, and it really frustrates me how there always has to be a romance almost in a YA novel. Now with this kind of like middle grade and lower sort of YA kind of age group, I thought, let's not make it about romance. Like, let's make it about social issues. Let's make it about the fact that, not all Asian people, even if they're from the same country, are the same. So Henry's sort of like language group is different from Wen's language group, but they've got commonalities. And so like, for me, I just wanted to really show you can have a friendship between people of two different genders. It does happen in real life. And it doesn't have to be loaded with romance, and it doesn't have any other element other than support. And so that's kind of what I tried to do with that friendship.
Obviously, a large theme within this book is Henry's mother and her struggle with depression at the beginning of the story, and her suicide being a major event in the plot. We would like to talk about these themes a little bit more, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
So I guess the first question we have is, how did you approach writing depression and suicide in this book?
It was kind of tricky because, I know of, community stories where this has actually happened. And so obviously it hasn't happened in my family, but, you kind of need to write about it sensitively, because sometimes like in, refugee or migrant families, there's like almost no, I guess, way out for some people. And so in terms of their mental health, like as you've sort of spoken to me before in the past, like the father deals with his mental health issues in a particular way, for example, by taking to his bed and not coming out for days and days. Whereas Henry's mother, I guess, doesn't see any way out and sort of takes a more drastic course. And what I wanted again to show was that, things like suicide and depression, they don't just happen to, wealthy people or white people. They happen to everybody. And so, it's sort of almost in a situation where you've got no money, you've got no hope, you've got no language, that kind of outcome is actually a realistic outcome. And I kind of wanted to say that, that whole idea of the model minority where, good Asian families or good migrant families put their heads down and work, and they keep out of trouble, and they, they're all just beavering away in the shadows, and, obviously there's nothing sort of dramatic going on for them. What I tried to show was it actually still does happen to them, but they've sort of even got less methods of trying to deal with depression and things like that, because they've got sort of no outlet. So a lot of migrant and refugee women, for example, if they don't speak English, they've got no outside networks. They can't just pick up the phone and ring a counsellor. They can't pick up the phone and speak to a government worker. They've just got no way to actually communicate their thoughts and feelings to people. And so this was kind of a fictionalised sort of like the worst case scenario for a family where the woman feels so isolated and so powerless and, so hopeless that this is the only option. And interestingly, I had a bit of a fight. Like I ordinarily don't fight changes with my editors and publishers, but they were very strong on I think the scene where I guess Henry sees his mother would have been a little bit more dramatic or a little bit more sort of detailed if I'd had my way. But because my publishers were saying this is kind of a tricky age group, you have to pull back on the detail a bit. So we kind of went back and forth for a few weeks about how much I could actually say. So this is where we settled.
Yeah, I did wonder whether having this audience in mind affect the way you write or approach this subject. So I think, yeah, I actually could picture it quite well, that devastating scene where Henry sees his mother without it being put on the page so explicitly. So I think you've done a great job.
That's great.
There.
So I think my publisher probably insisted correctly in that case, because I think I probably would have put in slightly more detail than that. And they kind of said it's implied enough without you having to go into, the necessary gory detail. So, yeah, it's kind of tricky to write about, but I just wanted to say, this stuff happens. And I wanted kids to see that, even after something like this happens in someone's life, you can come back from it.
We were also wondering if the comparison between Henry's mother's mental health issues and Wen's father's mental health difficulties were deliberate in any way.
They were a little bit deliberate in the sense that, I just wanted to show that I guess a female may have less outlet for, actually recovering from something like that. And I guess I've seen this in my own family, where people haven't sort of been treated kindly or they haven't sort of had the professional outcome they've wanted or something. It's actually driven them to despair so badly that they've actually just taken to their beds and not, emerged for days and days and, not showering, not eating, all that kind of stuff. That actually does happen. And so I think it's kind of, not that it's easier for a man to get out of depression, but I guess he has more support. He can kind of say to his wife, go heat me up some food. He's got people who can sort of jolly him back into the world. But someone like Henry's mother, who really literally has, no resources, no company, nothing to really kind of bring her back into the world other than her son, it's kind of a lot harder to come back from than, I guess, someone being unpleasant to, Wen's father at the restaurant. It's a little bit different. And I wanted to show that.
And I wonder if Henry's mother being a woman makes the community's reaction worse somehow. I'm trying to remember, I think Wen's Wen's dad was making a comment about how she was a failure as a mother. And instead of responding to her difficulties with sympathy, she was put down as a failure and shameful.
I don't know if you've ever seen this before in your own sort of family background, but often people will say about, people who are, suffering mental health issues, oh, she's a bad mother, or she wasn't brought up properly. And so for us, when I was actually writing the answers to the sort of teacher's notes that Alan and Umlin were preparing, they talked about suicide as if it was just a mental health issue. And I was kind of saying, well, the whole reaction to the suicide in this book, it's not just about mental health, it's almost about shame. Mm-hmm. It's about, you've brought shame down on people. It's more than, she actually had problems that she couldn't deal with. It's like she wasn't brought up properly. She's embarrassing her family. She's kind of bringing her name into ill repute. So for us, I think from an Asian background, there's this added element of, if you can't manage and you can't cope and you're not successful, you're also a shameful person who hasn't been raised in the proper way. So I tried to talk about that as well, I think, in a really subtle way. And I think a lot of Asian readers have really picked up on that shame element, whereas other people have just said suicide, equals, the after effects of depression. But there's this whole other thing of, my life didn't turn out the way I wanted. So there's that added element to it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I definitely relate to that. Interestingly, in the lead up to this interview, as we were preparing the questions, my mom, so I'm of Indonesian background, so my family is still in Indonesia. She told me that a neighbor completed suicide. We didn't know this person, but
everyone knows everyone. That's the thing. It's such a small place, right? So
that's right, and it sort of unfolded the same way as in your story. The child discovered the parent, and I thought it was interesting because we were obviously sympathizing with the parent, but there was a bit of that reaction of how could you do that to your child? And
and now that child will be marked forever and they'll never be a proper child, right? So there's that element as well, which I think, it has a particular cultural aspect to it that maybe, when you talk about youth suicide in Australia or sort of, female suicide or male suicide, there's not that element of your particular act is going to mark everyone for generations around you and everyone's going to talk about it forever as a test case. Don't do that. Don't be like that person because, it's going to bring shame to everyone. So that's one thing I really wanted to interrogate, because I don't think when we read sort of YA novels or middle grade novels about, people dying, there's not that added element of, well, they've not only done that to themselves, but they've done it to everyone around them.
And I think that really speaks to how, at least in the Australian sort of mental health and suicide prevention space, there is still this dominant narrative of this kind of individualistic approach to suicide as well. And there is an increase, I suppose, in awareness and programs and so on that are talking more about the ripple effect on communities. But the space is still very white, at least in the dominant discourse. So
there isn't that sort of extra nuance and that extra discussion of, what are the ramifications for the child or the sibling or the parents or the whatever, and how do we support those people?
Yeah.
Speaking of the emotions behind the story, we both found Tiger Daughter to be a very emotional story in terms of the reading experience itself. I know for myself, I read it in less than 24 hours, which is rare for me these days as an adult reader.
Yeah, you have no time. I know, that's the thing. Do you sort of work, or do you read, or do you, watch something? Because there's very little spare time.
Yeah, exactly. But this was a book that really caught me in the feels, to put it bluntly. I'm curious, was this an emotional book to write, or were the emotional parts of the book difficult to write for you?
It was super emotional to write because, I'm sort of well known as a fantasy writer, so I literally, have people with superpowers who can set other people on fire, right? So not saying that they're shallow, but the books don't have a great psychological depth to them because they're action adventure type things, right? But for this one, because I was so angry, and because it was such a personal thing, and I've drawn in, it's not autobiographical, because people often write to me and go, I'm so sorry, your childhood sounds terrible. And I'm like, no, that was not my childhood. There's elements of it, but that was not my childhood, right? But sort of dealing with things that had happened to me, like, for example, the bit where when at the start of the book says her father just burnt everything because he was unhappy with her. That happened to me. So, stuff like that, working through it is that was really wrong, right? Writing it down, you just kind of think, would I ever do that to my children? No, I wouldn't. That's not normal. So, that kind of stuff, working through little incidents like that, you kind of think about it as an adult and go, how would I have done that if I was feeling so furious and so powerless about something my child had done? What would I have done instead? So that was really hard to kind of, reassess all that kind of stuff. But also just dealing with, what the aftermath of a suicide would sort of do to a growing kid. A kid already who doesn't have many prospects and doesn't have many ways out has lost, one of his last emotional support. Even if I go back now and look at the storyline, there's one scene where I tear up. I wrote it. So, it's just weird because just that one scene, I always tear up. And I think it's because I just kind of think if my child was in that position, what would they do or what support would they have? And so that always makes me really sad. And so, yeah, it was hard to write because ordinarily I'm just having gleeful fun, just throwing crazy shiz into my stories. But this was very real, very small canvas, quite realistic, quite a narrow kind of arc. And you look at it and you think, well, the journeys that these people go on, they're not that big. But for them, inside the story, the journeys are massive.
And I think Wen's mom's story arc is actually a great example of that, from the outside, it might look like a small step, but for her to
actually sort of push back is enormous. That's the thing. I tried, because when you say it to someone, I remember I was talking to somebody else in an interview and I said, it doesn't look like anything on paper. Woman doesn't have a job. Woman gets a job at a chemist, right? It doesn't look like anything. But for her to get from point A to point B is this massive, massive, terrifying leap.
Yeah, absolutely. I didn't know how to word this as a question, but can we talk about the cultural impact on, of Wen's dad's background on his outlook on life or, his mental health and his parenting, I suppose, of Wen? Because it made me, my dad wasn't like him, but there were elements of it because when I was growing up, he used to make this joke about how if he died and we went to a medium or something, a Chinese medium, and asked, about him, the medium would say he had no children because he only had daughters.
Oh, that's a heavy joke. That's awful. Yeah, no. And it's the same with me because my father only had three girls, had 3 girls. So you see, I'm even doing it now, I'm internalizing it. But I've caught, like my cousin actually came to me, my cousin is in his 40s, came to me the other day and said, your father took me aside at a party and said, make sure you raise your children properly, right? So it's because he's got a male, progeny, and I never did. Oh, well, sorry, I do, but I'm not. My son doesn't have the same surname as my dad, and so he's gone to the cousin with the same surname and said, make sure you raise this boy properly. So that kind of stuff still happens a lot, and it's really difficult because, when you try and tell kids that the backbone of this story is a critique of Confucian philosophy and all the, patriarchy and all the kind of misogynistic stuff that is in between all of the words in there, their eyes just glaze over and roll back in their heads because they're just like, I'm not ready for the Chinese philosophy right now.
Yeah.
So that character of Wen's dad he's a distillation of, if I was going to raise my child in a strictly Confucian way and the child already is failing because she's not a boy, right, how would that look? And so he's kind of like a paradigm of, if you follow the Confucian tenets, which have, basically no room for women in them anywhere, Wen's dad is kind of an example of how that can run up against, more progressive thinking and a different sort of cultural background.
Yeah. No, I think going back to what you said before, he is the baddie of the story, but there is so much nuance to him.
He's human. Yeah. If someone's going to be unkind to the dad in a workplace setting, where's all that angst and anger going to go? If you've got nowhere to, spill it onto, it's your family.
You've previously said Tiger Daughter asks readers who have never been told, go back to where you come from and never will, to think about what it would be like to be marginalized for more reasons than being female. What would you like readers from different genders and cultural backgrounds to take away from this book?
What I wanted to say to them was, people do recognize you kids, like people do see you, because a lot of times, I'll go to a school library and speak to people and, librarians are the loveliest people in the world, but they don't necessarily see that the audience that they're, lending the books to may not necessarily be the same as, the books that they're pushing to them. And so what I want to say to migrant kids is, I, as an author, see you. I see you in your 2 spheres of influence, your home life, which is completely different from your public life at school. And I recognise that you have difficulties, and I recognise that you're trying to walk in 2 different worlds, and that they're quite sort of, sometimes not congruent at all. And so, what I want to say to migrant kids is, don't accept that box that people have sort of laid out for you. Push back as much as you can. One pushes back in really small ways, but it has a big outcome.
Yeah, lovely.
And I imagine that's what a lot of readers will be taking away from this book. And I do hope it ends up on more curriculums, because we clearly need more diverse and, bigger, better representation than what is currently being seen on these middle grade curriculums at the moment.
That's the hope. I'm hoping that one day in 30 years' time someone goes, can someone get that book off the book list? I'm so sick of seeing it. Can we have something new, please? That's the dream, right? But, hopefully one day, this is the hilarious thing. I don't think Alice will mind me saying this, right? But there was a review recently for Tiger Daughter which said Alice Pung wrote a really authentic novel. And so, what I want people to take from this is, it shouldn't be an Australian publishing landscape where there's one Alice and there's one Rebecca and they get mixed up. There should be authors from everywhere writing about everything, and people should be able to access whatever they want, whenever they want, in as much rich detail as they want. So, it's still the fact that I've been writing for 20 years and a book like this is seen as different and new is really disturbing to me.
Mm. And I think this leads in nicely with our final question for the interview today, which is, do you have any author or book recommendations that you would like to share with our listeners?
I just recently, I think I've been reading lots of stuff that's just made me absolutely bawl lately, but Nova Wheatman's The Jammer is beautiful, because that's about grief and about loss and how you come back from that, and, what's the shape of your family after someone is gone, and how do you sort of move forward from that? I've also just read Emily Gale's The Goodbye Year, which is like one of the first middle grade novels in this country to actually sort of consider what did COVID do to us? How did it affect kids? And I've got to say, I mean, this has made me cry buckets over the last few weeks, but my friend Gabrielle Williams, who was a YA author in Australia, she just passed away suddenly, and so I'm rereading all of her back catalogue, The Reluctant Hallelujah, It's Not You, It's Me. So she was just a brilliant, really funny, really sort of complex plotter of, YA kind of like contemporary with a time slip kind of humorous overlay to them. So I'm just rereading all her books now, just feeling so sad that I won't get any more books from her in future.
It does sound like it's been an emotional couple of months of reading for you. I will note that I read The Jammer, I think, right after I read Tiger Daughter.
And did you cry buckets as well?
Let's just say that was a very emotional reading week for me as well. Yeah. I just, 2 novels about grief and family. And
I know.
Beautiful, beautiful book. Okay, well, I think that wraps up all of our questions for today. So thank you so much, Rebecca, for joining us.
No worries.
Thank you so much for listening to our review today. And if you like us, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Find us on novelfeelings.com or on Instagram, Twitter, The Storygraph, and Goodreads, novel_feelings. And for your usual Bookstagram update, my bookshelves have arrived. Woohoo! So that means that I'll be picking up my books off the floor at some stage and putting them on the bookshelves, and then I can actually take photos again. And if you would like to watch that space, my Bookstagram is at paved-with-books with an extra S at the end.
Thank you so much, everybody, for listening. Hope you can tune in May for our next review episode. Take care.
See you then. Bye.